The document arrived at Clarence House shortly after 7 in the morning, sealed in a plain manila envelope bearing no return address. King Charles held it in both hands, before opening it, the way a man holds something he already suspects will wound him. Inside was a single letter, written in his younger son's unmistakable hand, and beneath the letter, a photocopied appendix stamped with the crest of a private legal chamber in California. The request was precise. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, was formally petitioning the crown for the return of the Spencer tiara, the diamond and pearl heirloom his mother, Diana, Princess of Wales, had worn on the morning of her wedding in July 1981. The tiara, a ceremonial object of the House of Spencer, entrusted to the royal collection after Diana's death, for reasons of security and provenance, was named in the letter as Diana's Sacred Royal Crown, a phrase underlined twice in ink. Charles read the phrase a second time. He removed his glasses. He placed them, folded, on the surface of the desk beside the envelope, and he did not move for a long moment. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The Spencer tiara, a family heirloom of the Earls Spencer rather than a possession of the crown, had passed through 4 generations of Spencer brides before Diana wore it into St. Paul's Cathedral. After the divorce, it had been catalogued in the royal collection for conservation and joint stewardship, a shared custody arrangement between the two houses. That arrangement, quiet and unspoken for decades, had never been challenged. It was being challenged now. King Charles sat alone in the study for the better part of an hour. He did not summon his private secretary. He did not lift the telephone. He read the letter 3 times, folded it once along its original crease, and returned it to the envelope with the care of a man who understood that whatever he did next would be recorded somewhere, by someone for a long time to come. At Kensington Palace, Prince William was already in receipt of a copy. His had arrived by courier, hand-signed for at the gate, the outer envelope marked personal. He read it standing at the window of his private office. He read it once, and then he closed the curtains himself. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, entered the room a few minutes later and found him standing in the half-light with the letter still in his hand. She did not ask. He handed it to her without a word. The wound in William was old and precise. He had been 13 years old when the tiara returned to the vaults, 13 when he had first been told, in the careful language adults use with grieving children, that certain objects belonging to his mother would be kept safe by the family and by the crown, together, forever. Forever had meant something to him then. It had continued to mean something to him. The letter in his wife's hand suggested that forever had a shelf life after all. Catherine read it in silence. She was a woman of formal composure, trained by years of duty, and she did not raise her eyes from the page until she reached the final line. When she looked up, she looked past her husband to the window and to the grey London morning beyond it. She placed the letter face down on the writing desk. She did not speak of it for the rest of the day. At Frogmore, in the quiet interior of a house that had once belonged to another era of the family, Prince Harry had already left for a scheduled engagement in Los Angeles. Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, remained behind for the morning, and by mid-afternoon, according to a documented private account later logged by Household Security, she was reviewing a printed folder marked with the letters SP in a small hand-drawn rectangle in the upper right corner. The folder contained draft language, correspondence templates, and a 2-page memorandum on the legal question of matrilineal succession of jewelry under English inheritance law. She read it with the attention of a woman preparing a case. At Buckingham Palace, Queen Camilla was informed by a senior aide before lunch. She received the news standing, as she preferred to receive difficult news, in the small drawing room that overlooked the garden. She listened without interruption. She thanked the aide. She asked whether the king had already read the letter. When told that he had, she asked no further questions. She walked to the window. She placed her hand flat against the cold glass for one measured moment, and then she withdrew it. Princess Anne, at Gatcombe Park, was told by telephone. She was in riding clothes. She did not sit down. She listened. She asked one question about the provenance documentation, and she said only, "Then we shall see what he actually knows." She replaced the receiver on the cradle with the same steady hand that had carried her through 5 decades of public service, and she went back out to the stables. The disputed object had a name now, in 5 separate households, spoken in 5 separate rooms, On the same grey Tuesday morning, the Spencer tiara, Diana's sacred royal crown, in the words of the letter, a ceremonial heirloom, in the words of the Royal Collection Catalogue, a shared trust, in the words of the quiet arrangement no one had ever written down. The disputed object had many names. What it did not have, in the strict language of the crown, was a single sovereign owner. That absence, deliberate and old, was about to become the fault line beneath the entire house. To understand how the letter came to be written at all, one had to return to the previous autumn, to a rehearsal held on a rainy Wednesday afternoon in the private chapel at Windsor. The rehearsal had been for the christening of a distant Spencer cousin's child, a small family occasion attended by fewer than 30 people. Among those present had been a retired palace jewel-keeper by the name of Malcolm Reeve, a man who had served in the Royal Collection Trust for 31 years before his quiet retirement in 2019. Reeve had been invited in a personal capacity, as an old family friend of the Spencer household. He had been permitted, as a courtesy, to remain in the chapel during the rehearsal itself. What was not recorded in the guest list, but was later reconstructed from a security log, was that Reeve had been approached during the reception afterwards by a member of the Sussex household staff. The conversation had lasted less than 4 minutes. It had taken place beside the tea urn. It had been, on its surface, entirely unremarkable. The member of staff had asked Reeve, in the tone of a person making small talk, whether it was true that certain items of the late Princess of Wales's personal jewelry had never been formally transferred to the crown by deed. Reeve, who had spent 3 decades cataloguing precisely such items, had answered honestly, it was true. Certain items, including the Spencer tiara, had been held in the royal collection under a stewardship arrangement rather than a transfer of title. The distinction, in the plain language Reeve preferred, was the distinction between a house-sitter and an owner. The crown had the keys. It did not have the deed. The member of staff had thanked him. The conversation had ended. Reeve had thought no more of it until, 3 weeks later, he had received a private letter on plain paper, asking whether he would be willing to provide, in a purely advisory capacity, a written account of the stewardship arrangement, as he understood it. The letter had offered a modest consultancy fee. It had been signed by a name Reeve did not immediately recognize, a solicitor operating out of a small chambers in Mayfair by the name of Adrian Whitcomb. Reeve had, according to his own later account recorded in an internal briefing, hesitated for 2 days before responding. He was a man who had signed the Official Secrets Act 4 times in his career. He was also a man who believed, with the quiet stubbornness of a lifelong civil servant, that the truth about who owned what was not a secret. Ownership was a matter of record. Records were in principle matters of fact. He had written back agreeing to answer, in writing, questions of general fact about the stewardship arrangement, provided that no images, no valuations, and no security details were requested. The correspondence had continued for 6 weeks. Whitcomb's questions had grown, in that time, more specific. By the end of the 6th week, they were no longer questions about general fact. They were questions about the precise wording of the stewardship instrument, about the identity of the signatories, about the presence or absence of a reversion clause, about whether, in the event of a formal request by a direct descendant of the Princess of Wales, the arrangement could be terminated. Reeve had answered the first 4 questions. He had declined the 5th. He had, on the day he declined, telephoned an old colleague at the Royal Collection Trust and told him, in careful language, that he believed he had been used. The colleague had made a note. The note had been filed. The note had, in the way of such things, sat unread in a records office for 4 months. By the time the note surfaced, the letter had already reached Clarence House. The private confrontation took place on a Thursday evening, 3 days after the letter arrived. It was held not in London but at Highgrove, in the small sitting room off the West Corridor that Charles used for conversations he did not wish to have witnessed. There were no advisors present. There were no aides. The only other person in the house that evening was the duty valet, who had been asked to remain in the servants' hall until called for. Harry had flown in that morning on a commercial flight. He had come alone. He had been driven from the airport by a hired driver, not a palace car, at his own request. He arrived at Highgrove at 6:07 in the evening, wearing a dark suit and carrying a slim leather portfolio. He was shown to the sitting room by the valet. His father was already there. Charles rose when his son entered. He did not extend his hand. He gestured to the chair opposite his own, and Harry sat. The portfolio was placed on the low table between them. Neither man spoke for the better part of a minute. Harry began. He spoke, according to a documented private account, later placed under seal, with the measured calm of a man who had rehearsed. He said that the letter had not been written in anger. He said that the tiara had belonged to his mother, that it had been worn by her on the most photographed morning of her life, that it carried a meaning for him and for his children that no catalogue entry could contain. He said that the stewardship arrangement, however well-intentioned, had never been ratified by Diana herself, and that the passage of time had not conferred upon it the authority of a formal deed. He said that he was not asking for a loan, he was asking for a return. He said the word return twice. Charles listened without interruption. He did not touch the portfolio. He did not remove his glasses. When Harry had finished, the king allowed the silence to hold for a count of perhaps 10 seconds. Then he spoke. "You did not lose her, Harry. You inherited her. There is a difference." He said nothing else. He did not raise his voice. He did not lean forward. He did not strike the table. He placed his right hand flat upon the arm of his chair, and he pressed his thumb once against the wood, and the small pressure of that gesture was the only outward sign of what the sentence had cost him. Harry did not reply immediately. He looked at his father for a long moment. Then he opened the portfolio. He removed a single sheet of paper. He placed it on the table between them, and he slid it across. The sheet was a photocopy of a handwritten note dated 1993, in the unmistakable hand of Diana, Princess of Wales. It was addressed to no one. It was a private memorandum, written in the small hours of a difficult night, and it contained a single line about the tiara, a line in which she referred to the piece as belonging, in her own words, to her sons. Charles read the line. He read it twice. He did not touch the paper. He looked at his son across the table, and for a moment, the man in the chair was not the monarch, but the father. And the father was tired, and the father was wounded, and the father did not know how to answer a piece of his dead wife's handwriting. The moment passed. The monarch returned. Charles folded his hands. He said, in the same measured voice with which he had spoken before, that he would consider the document. He said that consideration was not consent. He said that the family would convene. He said that Harry would be informed of the decision through the proper channels. He rose. He walked to the door. He held it open. Harry gathered the portfolio. He left the photocopy on the table. He walked past his father without speaking, and he did not look back. The family council convened 4 days later, on a Monday afternoon, in the library at Windsor Castle. The room had been chosen for its privacy and for the weight of its history. Present were the King, the Prince of Wales, the Princess Royal, and Queen Camilla. The Princess of Wales was not present in the room, but joined by secure video link from Anmer Hall, where she had remained with the children during the half-term recess. No aides were present, no secretaries. The doors were locked from the inside, and the key was placed on the long table in the center of the room, in full view of all those present, as was the custom for meetings of this kind. The king opened the proceedings without ceremony. He placed on the table a single folder, bound in dark green leather, bearing the crest of the Royal Collection Trust. Inside the folder was the original stewardship instrument, executed in September 1997, in the weeks following the death of the Princess of Wales. The instrument had been signed by 3 parties: the then Prince of Wales, on behalf of his sons, the then Earl Spencer, on behalf of the Spencer family, and the then Keeper of the Royal Collection, on behalf of the Crown. It was a 2-page document. It had never been made public. Charles read the operative clause aloud. The clause, drafted in the careful legal English of the late 20th century, provided that the Spencer tiara, together with certain other named items, was to be held by the Royal Collection Trust as steward, not as owner, for the benefit of the 2 houses jointly, until such time as a formal instrument of transfer or return should be executed by mutual agreement of the surviving signatories or their lawful successors. He read the final phrase twice: mutual agreement. Princess Anne was the first to speak. She observed with the plain directness that had always been her signature, that mutual agreement was a bar that no single party could unilaterally clear. She observed also that the surviving signatory on the Spencer side was the current Earl Spencer, Diana's brother, and that no one in the room had spoken to him about the letter. She suggested that this omission be corrected before the afternoon was out. Queen Camilla, seated to the king's right, added a second observation. She noted, without emphasis, that the letter from Prince Harry had made no reference to the stewardship instrument. It had spoken of Diana's sacred royal crown, as though the tiara were an item of undivided personal property. It was not. It had not been for 29 years. Whatever moral claim the letter advanced, it advanced in ignorance or in disregard of the document now lying open on the table. The Prince of Wales spoke last. He had said little for most of the meeting. When he spoke, he did not raise his voice. He said that he did not wish to litigate his brother's grief. He said that he understood, better than anyone in the room save perhaps his father, what the tiara had meant and continued to mean. He said that he was prepared to consider any reasonable proposal for revised display, for loan, for shared exhibition. He said that he was not prepared to consider the surrender of an object his mother had entrusted, in her own handwriting elsewhere in the same private memorandum, to the safekeeping of the family into which she had married. He paused. He looked at the folder. He said in a quieter voice, "She wrote more than one line that night." The revelation came near the end of the meeting. It came from Princess Anne, who had spent the previous week making quiet telephone calls to old colleagues at the Royal Collection Trust. She placed on the table a slim manila file. Inside the file was a printout of an email trail, recovered from a dormant account belonging to the former palace jewel keeper, Malcolm Reeve, and a copy of the note Reeve's colleague had filed 4 months earlier, and which had lain unread in the records office until the previous Friday. The email trail told a clear story. Between the previous September and the previous December, Reeve had answered a series of increasingly specific questions from a solicitor named Adrian Whitcomb. The questions had drawn from him, piece by piece, the precise architecture of the stewardship instrument, the wording of Harry's letter, when placed beside the wording of Reeve's answers, revealed a pattern of borrowing so exact that in 3 separate paragraphs entire phrases had been transposed without alteration. The letter had not been written from grief alone. It had been drafted from a blueprint. Charles looked at the file for a long moment. He did not speak. He closed the folder in front of him. He placed his hand flat upon its cover. He said at last only that the family would need time to consider. He asked that no word of the meeting leave the room. He asked that Earl Spencer be contacted that evening through the private channel and informed of the letter, of the instrument, and of the answer the family intended to give. The meeting adjourned. The key was lifted from the table. The doors were unlocked. The 4 principals left the library one by one, at intervals of 3 minutes, as was the custom for meetings of this kind. The story escaped the palace within 72 hours. It did not escape through Reeve, who by then had been quietly informed by an old colleague that his correspondence had been reconstructed, and that his continued cooperation with any external party would be regarded as a serious matter. It did not escape through Whitcomb, whose small chambers in Mayfair had, on the Tuesday morning, received a formal letter from the Treasury solicitor requesting a full account of his instructions and his client. It did not escape through the 4 principals of the family council, none of whom had spoken of the meeting to anyone outside the library. It escaped, in the way such stories almost always escape, through a peripheral figure who had not been present in any of the rooms that mattered, but who had been close enough to catch the edge of the conversation. A junior member of the Sussex household staff in Los Angeles, a young woman on a 6-month contract, had been asked to prepare a travel itinerary for a return flight to London in early spring. The itinerary had included a note referencing a meeting at Highgrove and a second meeting at a firm of solicitors in the city. The young woman had shown the note, in confidence, to a friend. The friend had shown it to a partner. The partner had, for reasons that were later the subject of a private inquiry, forwarded the note to a freelance correspondent who specialized in royal affairs. The freelance correspondent had made 3 telephone calls. On the 3rd call, a former palace source, unnamed and untraceable, had confirmed that a letter had been sent, that a tiara was at issue, and that the family was divided. By Thursday morning, the story was on the front pages of 2 mid-market dailies. By Thursday afternoon, it was leading the rolling news channels. By Thursday evening, it had crossed the Atlantic and was being discussed on American breakfast television. The coverage was, in the phrase of the family's own communications office, mostly wrong in the details and entirely wrong in the tone. One channel, a rolling news outlet with a large midday audience, ran a panel discussion in which a former royal correspondent, a constitutional commentator, and a celebrity biographer debated for 47 minutes the question of whether Prince Harry had the legal right to reclaim, in the phrase that recurred throughout the segment, his mother's crown. The phrase was not accurate. The tiara was not a crown. The Spencer tiara was a private family heirloom, worn at a wedding, catalogued for stewardship, and no more a crown than a wedding ring is a scepter. The distinction was made once, by the constitutional commentator, in the closing minute of the segment. It was not repeated. At Kensington Palace, the Prince of Wales watched the coverage in silence. He watched it standing, in the small sitting room adjacent to his office, with the sound turned low. Catherine sat on the sofa behind him. Neither of them spoke. The segment ended. A new segment began, on the same channel, in which a panel of 3 commentators, none of whom had been present in any room that mattered, discussed what they described as the King's cold refusal to return Diana's legacy to her son. The phrase struck William with a specific force. He heard it once. He did not turn his head. He heard it a second time, from a different commentator, in a slightly different arrangement of words. He walked to the television. He did not turn it off. He turned the volume down until the room was entirely silent, and he stood watching the moving pictures, without their voices, for a long moment. The King's cold refusal. The phrase reached Clarence House within the hour. It was not repeated to the King by his private secretary, who understood the man he served, but it was placed in the daily briefing folder that lay on the desk in the study when Charles returned from his afternoon audience. Charles read the briefing. He read the phrase. He did not react. He closed the folder. He walked to the window. He looked out at the grey London afternoon for a long moment, and he pressed his fingers once against his forehead. He did not speak of it that evening. He did not speak of it the following morning. He spoke of it, for the first and only time, on the Saturday afternoon, in a private conversation with his son, the Prince of Wales, in the small garden at the back of Highgrove. William had driven down alone that morning. The 2 men walked the length of the yew hedge without speaking. At the far end, where the hedge turned toward the rose walk, the King stopped. He looked at his son. He said in a voice barely above the wind, "They believe I am cold, let them." He said nothing else. He walked on. William followed. The subject was not raised again between them for a long time. The quiet reckoning came the following Monday. The King had, over the weekend, requested from the Treasury solicitor a formal review of the stewardship instrument and its enforceability under current law. The review had been completed by Sunday evening. It confirmed, in 7 paragraphs of measured legal English, that the instrument remained fully in force, that no unilateral termination was available to any single party, and that the wording of the operative clause required, as a matter of contract, the mutual agreement of the surviving signatories or their lawful successors. The current Earl Spencer had, on the Friday evening, communicated to Clarence House through the private channel his position on the matter. The position was that he had not been consulted on the letter, that he did not support it, and that he regarded the stewardship arrangement as a settled matter of family honor, to which he had no wish to see any alteration. Charles read the review. He read the Earl's communication. He placed both documents in a single folder. He did not act in anger. He did not summon the press office. He did not authorize a statement. He did what he had always done in matters of family and matters of state alike. He set a boundary in writing. The directive, drafted by his private secretary under his personal supervision and finalized on the Monday morning, was a document of 3 pages. It was addressed to the Keeper of the Royal Collection, to the Treasury Solicitor, and to the private secretaries of every senior member of the family. It was signed by the King. It bore the Privy Seal, the official emblem proving that the instruction operated under Crown authority. The directive did 4 things. It reaffirmed, in the plainest possible language, that the stewardship instrument of 1997 remained in full force, and that no unilateral request from any single descendant or affiliated party would be entertained as a basis for its variation. It required that any future request touching upon items held under joint stewardship arrangements be submitted through the Keeper of the Royal Collection in writing, with full documentary support, and be reviewed in the first instance by a standing committee of 3, 1 representative from each of the affected houses, and 1 independent legal advisor. It provided that any use of restricted internal knowledge, whether obtained from current or former palace personnel, in the preparation of any such request, would render the request void on procedural grounds, and would trigger a formal internal inquiry. It provided in the fourth and final clause that the Spencer tiara itself would be transferred within 30 days from the general storage of the royal collection to the specific care of the Prince and Princess of Wales at Kensington Palace, under a revised stewardship note countersigned by the current Earl Spencer, for display and safekeeping in a dedicated room, in accordance with the wishes recorded in Diana's own hand in the fuller text of the 1993 memorandum, the text of which was appended to the directive as a sealed clarification. The directive was not a punishment, it was a wall. It was a wall built in the careful language of the Crown, with mortar of law and stone of family, and it was built not to keep anyone out, but to keep something in. The directive was communicated to Prince Harry through the proper channels on the Monday evening. He received it at his home in Montecito at a little after 5 o'clock local time. It was delivered by a member of the British consular staff in Los Angeles, who had been briefed to hand the sealed envelope to the Duke of Sussex in person and to await no reply. Harry read the directive in his private study. He read it once, all the way through. He read it a second time, more slowly, pausing at the fourth clause. He came at last to the sealed clarification, which contained the fuller text of the 1993 memorandum. And he read the sentences that his mother had written in the small hours of a difficult night, sentences that he had not seen before. The sentences did not contradict the single line he had quoted in his own letter. They surrounded it. They gave it context. In the context of the fuller memorandum, the single line about the tiara belonging to her sons was followed by a longer passage in which Diana wrote that she wished the piece to remain with the family into which she had married, to be worn one day by the wife of her elder son, and to pass through that line into the future of the house. Harry read the passage twice. He closed the folder. He placed it on the desk in front of him. He did not speak. He walked to the window of the study, which looked out over the courtyard and the low California hills beyond, and he stood there for a long time. Meghan came to the door of the study a little after 6. She did not enter. She looked at her husband, and at the folder on the desk, and at the closed curtain of his shoulders, and she went away without speaking. In the hall, she placed the phone she had been holding face down on the console table. She did not pick it up again that evening. The palace statement was issued on the Wednesday morning. It was 1 paragraph long. It was drafted by the King's private secretary and reviewed by the King himself. It was released at 10:30 in the morning through the standard channels. The statement read, in full, that the Royal Collection Trust confirmed the continuation of the long-standing stewardship arrangement in respect of certain items of jewelry associated with the late Diana, Princess of Wales, that a revised stewardship note had been executed with the concurrence of the Earl Spencer, and that the family regarded the matter as closed. It made no reference to the letter. It made no reference to Prince Harry. It made no reference to the Spencer tiara by name. It was, in the phrase of one of the King's oldest advisors, cold in the way that snow is cold, which is to say not from anger but from altitude. The morning newspapers, on the following day, ran the story on their front pages. One mid-market daily, in a headline set in a heavy black type across the width of its front page, printed 3 words above a photograph of the young Diana on the morning of her wedding, the tiara catching the light. The headline read, "The family holds," 3 words, a verdict. The story faded from the front pages within a week. It faded from the rolling news within 10 days. It did not fade from the family. It gud not. What had been asked, and what had been refused, and what had been written in the directive that now sat in a locked drawer in the office of the Keeper of the Royal Collection, would remain in the private memory of the house for as long as the house endured. Prince Harry did not issue a public response. He did not speak of the letter. He did not speak of the tiara. In the weeks that followed, he continued his engagements in California, and he spoke, in the ordinary way, of his work, of his children, of the causes to which he had committed his public life. The subject of the Spencer tiara did not return to his lips. Those close to him observed, in a documented private account, later shared in confidence with a senior member of the household, that he had grown quieter in the evenings, that he had taken to walking alone in the garden after dinner, that he had, on more than one occasion, been seen with a small framed photograph of his mother that he had not previously kept on his desk. The Prince and Princess of Wales received the tiara on the appointed date, 30 days after the directive was issued. The transfer was made without ceremony, in the presence of the keeper of the royal collection and of the current Earl Spencer, who had travelled down from Althorpe for the occasion. Catherine signed the revised stewardship note. William countersigned. Earl Spencer countersigned. The three signatures sat one beneath the other on the same page, in blue ink, in the careful hand of three people who understood what they were signing. The tiara was placed that evening in a small display case in the private sitting room at Kensington Palace, in a room that had been prepared for it during the preceding month. The display case was of oak, with glass on three sides, and it was lit from within by a single low light. Above the case, on the wall, hung a small photograph of Diana, Princess of Wales, taken on a summer afternoon in 1996, 1 year before her death. She was smiling. She was not wearing the tiara. She was wearing a white shirt and no jewelry at all. Catherine, on the evening the tiara was placed in the case, stood in the room for a long time. She did not touch the glass. She did not speak. She stood, with her hands folded in front of her, and she looked at the piece her husband's mother had worn into a cathedral more than 4 decades earlier, and she thought, in the private way that people think in such rooms, about promises, and about the keeping of them, and about the strange weight of objects that outlive the hands that wore them. She left the room. She closed the door. She did not open it again that night. The institution had held. The stewardship arrangement, drafted in the grief of 1997 and tested in the pressure of the present, had proved itself equal to the strain. A directive had been issued. A boundary had been drawn. A wall had been built, of law and of family, and behind the wall the tiara sat now in its oak case, in a room in Kensington Palace, in the safekeeping of the house into which Diana had married, and to which, in her own hand, she had entrusted its future. Royal authority cannot be seized, borrowed, or pressured into surrender, however moving the language of the request, or however skillful the assembly of the case. It is earned, and it is held. Only through the long discipline of loyalty and service, and through the keeping of promises made in rooms no camera has ever entered. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next.